Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Beatrice and today I have a video for you on 20th century poet T.S. Eliot. Now, I used to really dislike Eliot actually. My first exposure to his poetry was through his poem The Wasteland, which I didn't appreciate when I first read it, or when I read it for the second time, to be honest. And so for a long time I thought that I could never enjoy T.S. Eliot, but I have completely changed my mind, and what has made me change my mind in recent years has been my experience of being exposed to a later selection, or rather sequence, of poems of his called the Four Quartets, this little volume right here. The Four Quartets is a sequence of 4 poems called Burnt Norton, East Coker, The Dry Selvages and Little Gidding, in which Eliot meditates on his spiritual journey, I would say. And I believe that the Four Quartets are a great example of how poetry and prayer can overlap and intersect in very interesting ways. So I want to tell you a little bit about that today, and try to convince you to read Eliot in case, like me, you're someone who assumed for a long time that you could not enjoy his poetry. Now, let's start by talking a little bit about the relationship between poetry and prayer. It is one that I think can be traced back to the very roots of Christianity, of the Christian faith. For example, the Psalms can be considered poems, but they are also obviously prayers that are used in by many Christians in their daily prayer life. And as well as this, we can think of the example of Boethius in the late classical era. The philosopher Boethius actually includes sections of prayer in verse in his work, The Consolation of Philosophy. Even later on, so jumping to the medieval period, we have something like the theologian Bonaventure, who included sections of poetry in his work, The Soul's Journey into God. And later in the 16th century, we have the figure of St. John of the Cross, who is known as both a mystic, a poet, and a theologian, and whose poem The Dark Night of the Soul is alluded to in Eliot's own poetry. The point is that historically there are lots of examples of poetry working as prayer, and prayers taking the form of poetry, and there is not always a clear distinction between the two. Then we get to Eliot himself. I think a book that really illuminated the role of prayer for Eliot for me was a book called Anglo-Catholic and Religion, which I will show you in a second. This book here, I think you can find copies of this for quite cheap secondhand online. This is called Anglo-Catholic and Religion by Barry Spurr. And what I find really interesting is that in this book, Spurr points out that for Eliot, prayer was really a fundamental part of living out his faith. He was someone who, once he converted and became an Anglo-Catholic, was extremely serious about his faith. And he was really strongly drawn to religious communities, even though he was never part of one himself necessarily. He really liked the strictness and the regulation of monastic life. He visited, for example, a Church of England male monastic community called the Society of the Sacred Mission at Kelham, where he wrote many of his major later works. Spurr notes that characteristically he was very strict about his praying habits. That was kind of Eliot's personality. He was known to be someone who was quite kind of strict and uptight. And Spurr concludes as follows: more so than any other aspect of religious routine and discipline, prayer and meditation were emphasized by Eliot time and again as the bedrock of faith, sustaining the Christian in daily life, especially in the secular world. As well as this, we know from Eliot's correspondence to his longtime friend and potentially love interest, Emily Hale, that Eliot particularly loved the Psalms. In a letter dated 29th of September 1939, so right as World War II was beginning, Eliot tells Hale that he has sent her a copy of his daily prayers, not so that she may use them, as her own Christian denomination was incompatible with them, but so that she can picture exactly how he prays when he prays for her. And he emphasizes as follows in this letter to her. A psalm or two is very good reading at the end of the day, and some of them are highly appropriate for this time, by which obviously he means war times. I am very sorry for the people who have to live through this age without any definite religious faith. What sense can be made of life without it? The Psalms, then, we know, are of great comfort to Eliot at a time of instability and loss, both personally but also, worldwide due to war. But in what ways can we consider Eliot's own poems as a form of prayer? That's really the question that I want to ask today. Well, first of all, I would argue that the poems I've mentioned to you, the 4 quartets, are poems in which, much like Dante does in the Divine Comedy, we see Eliot going on a spiritual pilgrimage from disillusion and disbelief to a renewed faith in God and in ultimate salvation. His 4 poems, Burnt Norton, East Coker, The Dry Salvages, and Little Gidding, also all have a very sacramental view of the world. That is, what I mean is Eliot sees the world, the created world, as a sacrament, meaning that he can at once recognize the beauty of the created world, while at the same time knowing that it is just a sign, a sacrament meaning a sign of something greater beyond, and thus that eventually it must be transcended. So the idea is you can recognize, for example, the beauty of nature, knowing that it was created by God, but also know that it is not the ultimate home for us, that nature in its beauty is a sign, a sacrament of what we will experience in heaven, if and when we get there. So let's have a look at a few examples of what I mean by this. Let's take the first of the 4 quartets, Burnt Norton. In this poem, Eliot describes the enchanted memory of a rose garden. This enchantment lasts but a moment, and yet it is so meaningful for Eliot because he recognizes that the beauty of the created world is necessary on our journey towards God's eternity in heaven. Eliot writes as follows: "But only in time can the moment in the rose garden, the moment in the arbour where the rain beat, the moment in the draughty church at Smokefall be remembered, involved with past and future. Only through time is time conquered." Let me read to you again just that last line of this passage that I've selected. Only through time, time is conquered. I believe the above passage is key to our understanding of Eliot's lyricism as deeply, deeply rooted in prayer and the spiritual journey of the soul towards God. Although the ultimate goal is to reach a place not of this world, it is only through our experience of the world in time, so while we are alive, that we can even think of reaching such a place. We can only conquer time, meaning we can only join God in his eternity through time, because our human experience is necessarily temporal. That's all we know. At the end of such a journey, we come to a point where this moment in the rose garden can be remembered. That is, a moment where the beauty of creation acts as a sacrament, a sign pointing to the beauty of the divine outside of time. Eliot's sacramental vision is reinforced, I think, in part 4 of The Dry Salvages, which is the third of the 4 poems that I'm discussing today. And The Dry Salvages discusses at greater length this spiritual journey of the faithful through an appeal to Christ's own mother, Mary. I will read for you the first few lines of the 4th section of this poem, since they're very beautiful. Lady, whose shrine stands on the promontory, Pray for all of those who are in ships, those whose business has to do with fish, and those concerned with every lawful traffic, and those who conduct them. Repeat a prayer also on behalf of women who have seen their sons or husbands setting forth and not returning. This entire section of poetry, I think, can be seen as both an invitation to prayer and prayer in and of itself. Eliot actually begins directly by addressing Christ's mother. The first line of the section is "Lady." He is very, very directly asking Christ's mother to pray for us. And so it can be recognized as a prayer of petition, meaning that Eliot is petitioning, essentially. So he's asking Christ's mother Mary to pray for us, and for any of us who need God's help. And I think it's particularly poignant because this part of the Four Quartets was written during the air raids of 1941, during World War II. And he's thinking about all the women whose sons and husbands left for the war and might not have returned, might never return, essentially. And that's what I find so compelling about this section of the Dry Salvages, which is that it is once really historically specific. It's to do with World War II, it's to do with a very particular time in history, but also it is a universally applicable prayer. There's always a time in someone's life at any point in history when they need to ask for someone else to pray for them to God and to pray that God may help them. Now, I've given you a couple of examples just now of how seriously Eliot takes faith in his poetry, and I've suggested to you that his view of the world is essentially sacramental and is to do with our spiritual journey towards God and heaven. And I've also given you an example just now of a section of poetry that is a direct prayer to God through Christ's Mother Mary. But let me now show you just one more example that I think is even a clearer example of how Eliot believes his poetry to be a form of prayer. Let me tell you a little story about Eliot. In 1936, Eliot visited a village in Cambridgeshire called Little Gidding. This village was of interest to him because it was associated with a family called the Ferrers, who lived there in the 17th century. Nicholas Ferrer was a friend of the now very well-known poet George Herbert, and himself a very devout man who led his family in prayer every day, several times a day, at the Little Gidding Chapel. Eliot was really struck by reading about this family. He was struck by their commitment to a life of prayer, and even decided to title the last of the four quartets Little Gidding, in honour of this little village where Ferrer and his family had such a devout community who shared a faith and shared such a strong devotion to God. So this final poem of the four quartets, Little Gidding, is particularly interesting to me because it is the most personal to Eliot himself, but also reads like the most universal one, I think. It's the one that I could relate to the most when I read it, at least. Like all good prayers, and like all good poems, in my opinion at least, Little Gidding expresses an experience that is very, very specific to Eliot, but one that I think we can all relate to. So when Eliot speaks in the first person or addresses the reader, he is both speaking for the whole of humanity. So he's just one person, but he's kind of speaking as though he represents all of us. And he's speaking to all of humanity. He speaks to you, the reader, directly, but in such a way that you could be anyone and something that he says could relate to you. In the first section of Little Gidding, Eliot addresses us, the readers, directly in a few lines of poetry that I find particularly impactful, which I will now read for you. You are not here to verify, instruct yourself, or inform curiosity. or carry report. You are here to kneel where prayer has been valid. How beautiful is that? I will just read you the last line and a half because it's probably my favourite passage from the entire four quartets. You are here to kneel where prayer has been valid. So where Eliot says you are here to kneel, the you is anyone really who encounters the poem, but the you is also Eliot himself. He is also speaking to himself. This is a reminder to him of the importance of prayer, of the crucial importance of prayer in our lives. Wisdom can only be attained through humility and contemplation, and so to do things like verify or instruct is not enough. Eliot could not be clearer. You, his reader, are here to kneel where prayer has been valid. That is, you are here to be in an attitude of humility. In the very next line, Eliot actually reminds us that prayer is more than an order of words. Just so, his poetry is more than just a series of stylistic choices. It is more than being clever about the way you use similes or metaphors or any other kind of poetic devices, or having a wide-ranging vocabulary. That's not really the point of poetry, or at least it's not the point of good poetry. For Eliot, poetry should be an invitation to contemplate. It should be an invitation to understand his poetry and poetry in general as a form of prayer, a particularly lyrical and beautiful form of prayer perhaps, but prayer nonetheless. And the point of poetry should be to grow in wisdom through prayer. So if you've heard of Eliot and think that perhaps he's not really the poet for you, I hope I've been able to convince you today that there is a lot more to his poetry than all these kind of allusions and all of this complicated language, which he can do a lot of that. The Wasteland is particularly bad for that kind of thing. It's very intimidating poetry, but I would really suggest that you try the four quartets if you want to give Eliot another go, because they are such beautiful poems, and if you're someone for whom faith is important in your life, I think you will really, really love them. I think these poems might change your mind about Eliot just being an overly kind of complicated and complex poet who is very inaccessible. I think actually the four quartets, especially Little Gidding, the last one, whilst still at times complex to get through, I think is much more accessible, especially if you read it out loud or if you listen to a recording of it. That's actually how I first heard the four quartets. I went to hear a recital of them, and that really, really helped me to grasp the meaning. And even now when I reread them, I often read passages out loud to help me get most out of the meaning of these poems. And I've even found it really wonderful to incorporate passages from the four quartets into my own prayer life, and I found that to be a really beautiful experience. So they're definitely poems that grow with you the more you reread them, and I would suggest that that you start reading them now, so that in a few years' time you feel like you've really grown with them as a reader, and that they have grown on you. So let me know if I have convinced you to give Eliot a go. Perhaps you were already predisposed to give Eliot a go, in which case you're less prejudiced than I was when I first started reading Eliot, because I had a really hard time. But yeah, let me know in the comments if you have any suggestions about what kind of video I should be making next, or if you have any thoughts on Eliot, on poetry, on prayer, any of the things that I talked about today. And hopefully I will see you soon in my next video. I have a feeling that the next long format video that I make might be the last one before I give birth, so after that that might be a bit of a break for a few weeks, but hopefully I should be back before Christmas with more videos for you. Perhaps we can return to a Jane Austen video at some point closer to Christmas, as it wouldn't really feel right to finish the year without making one more Jane Austen video. But the next video that I will be filming is probably going to be on Kazuo Ishiguro, so you should definitely look out for that one in a couple of weeks' time. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you soon. Bye.